Our next speaker is Jake VanDeWater, Vice President of Engineering Operations and IT at SDN Communications. Jake has worked in the broadband telecommunications and fixed wireless industries since 2003 and has a wide range of technical and administrative experience. He has been Vice President of Engineering, Operations, and IT since January 2020. As a Vice President and member of the company's executive team, he leads the strategic direction of engineering, operations, and IT. This session will explore how remote employees affect business and how to ensure your remote office is as secure as your corporate office space. Jake will discuss the increase in attacks and what behavior and tactics can help secure your remote workspace. Jake, welcome to the conference.
Good morning. I'm Jake VanDeWater with SDN Communications. I'm the Vice President of Engineering, Operations, and IT. And today I'm going to be talking to you about some safety tips related to working remote. So I've been at SDN Communications since 2015. Recently this year, I took over the role as Vice President of Engineering, Operations, and IT. My career is predominantly centered around the broadband telecommunications industry and the fixed wireless industry. So today's agenda heavily going to focus first on just an overview of SDN, our network, and what we've seen as far as the activity over the last year related to that network. Then we're going to move into just some basic tips as far as working from home. We kind of call it getting settled at home, related to just making sure you're set up for success with some best practices, making sure your network and your internet is ready as you make that transition or as you're looking to increase the activity of working remote. From there, we're going to talk about just some potential threats to be on the lookout for, those including what we call business email compromise, or BEC, ransomware, and then some combination of tactics that have become more popular over the last year as well. And as I wrap up, I'll leave you today with just some basic prevention methods that are good tips to follow as you're working remote or in the office. So SDN Communications is a business-to-business network connectivity provider. We are based here in Sioux Falls, and we're owned by the 17 independent phone companies with the state of South Dakota. With that partnership of those phone companies, as well as SDN's network, we cover well over 80% of the geography of the state of South Dakota. In addition to those South Dakota members, we also have partnerships, which we refer to as Southern Minnesota Broadband, with a number of Minnesota and Iowa independent phone companies. Through these partnerships, it allows us to really extend the reach of our network and continue to provide reliability and what we refer to as our network uptime. SDN serves a variety of industries, the core 8 really being healthcare, critical services like 911, the financial industry, cellular services, the wireless carriers, agriculture, state government, manufacturing, and education. So you may not think of SDN right away as you're doing that online banking or maybe making that cellular call, but our network is there. We're really behind the scenes, and we're a core piece of providing those critical services. So as we started to move towards this work remote in the first quarter of this year, one of the common questions that we heard and many service providers were asked was, are the networks ready? So we had confidence in our network. As we start to plan and look towards the future, we really plan to the peak and beyond. And so as we evaluate just our month-over-month internet growth, we started seeing a pretty good increase when it came to a March-over-March annual growth from 2019. Now, you'll see here that as we started to move into some of the nicer months into May and June, we saw just a pretty significant reduction over the previous months. Now, as we go back to the March timeframe, our network typically sees a busy time or a peak time towards the evening hours of the day. Now, with the pandemic activity, we saw an average increase and a sustained increase of 50 gigs starting March 16th. Now, as I mentioned about the year-over-year planning, we typically see a 30% growth and expansion of our internet connectivity from each year. Now, from 2019 going into 2020, we saw that actually go up 39%, and it was directly attributed to just the work remote situation that many of us were in. In addition, for 2020, we've actually seen an all-time new peak for our network since we've had that built, and we continue to see that and plan for that in the future. So another interesting fact is when it relates to just phone minutes, we saw some increase in some very busy sustained times of regular minutes of use that some compare just to busy calling days like Mother's Day. So moving from there and talking about just getting settled in at home, the first advice I wanted to offer is really looking and talking to your internet service provider. So make sure that you have the conversation with them to confirm what level of speed you're subscribed to, and make sure that matches what you intend on doing. So what that means is if you're going to have multiple people work at home, your service provider can certainly work with you and make sure you're on the right plan. Now, as we kind of think about this, talking about your internet service provider and moving more into, let's say, into your home or into your network, the next device I want to talk about is really the gateway to your network, and that may be a router or a firewall. The first step there is having the proper security and maybe some encryption with that. Could be as basic as making sure you're not using default passwords and making sure that when it comes to your wireless connectivity, if you're using it, that you have the right encryption and password security in place there. And then as you're continuing that usage at home, making sure that those devices are getting regular updates. Those regular updates will help it prevent any potential bugs or vulnerabilities that may be in place from a vendor perspective. So going from there, from your router or your firewall, moving to your individual computer, the first thing I want to talk about is a VPN. This is your virtual private network. So if you're connecting back to your central office or your corporate location, maybe accessing some of those key systems or files that are at your workplace, you want to make sure you're doing that in a secure fashion. A VPN will allow you an end-to-end encrypted connection so that that data, as it transits and leaves your home and goes towards its location at your work, that's encrypted and safe and secure. In addition, as you're doing that work on your machine at home, making sure that you're utilizing that for business applications. As you start to stray from that and maybe use, whether it's gaming or social media, as our keynote mentioned earlier today, especially with social media, there's a lot more at risk and potential threats can be exposed in that fashion. In addition, password security. This is really a basic one, but making sure that you're still using good passwords that are updated regularly, that are unique for your computer as well as the systems you're accessing. And a simple one, locking your device. We talk about it a lot in the workplace, especially if you're maybe in a social setting where that device is not as secure. So if something happens to that device, whether it be malicious intent or just accidental from perhaps the kids getting on your machine and doing something, you want to make sure that best practice is followed. And then software updates. Regardless of if you're in the office or at home, you really need to make sure that those are done regularly, whether that be for the operating system or the software applications on your machine. Those are patching and identifying, so software updates come out because they've identified some sort of vulnerability or bug that could be accessed and then cause a disruption in your system, so you want to make sure those are done. The next is backups, making sure that those files and those items are getting backed up, and especially offline backups, so that if those are backed up on a machine, there's certainly more at risk with those being accessed during some sort of disruption of the system or infection of the system. And then the next item there is encryption. So with encryption, what we're talking about here is actually encrypting the disk so that when the machine is not in use, that data is encrypted. So in the event your laptop was lost, misplaced, you wouldn't be concerned. It would be difficult for them to decrypt that and actually access your data. Your data would still be secure. And then the final thing I'll leave you with at getting settled in home is simply following your employer's security policies. Regardless of if you're in the office or working from home, this is a good, simple best practice. There's a reason those policies are developed. Even better for them to be followed and stuck to regardless of your physical location. So from there, I want to just transition into some of the tactics and threats that are out there, and we'll speak through to these. And the first one being business email compromise or phishing scams. The next one being ransomware, which we heard a little bit more about today. And then just moving into a combination of tactics that are becoming very predominant here this year. Those are phishing, scraping, and vishing. So business email compromise, what is it? The characteristics of that are really social engineering. So social engineering, which is really the use of deception to manipulate us as individuals to try and get some source of data from us and then use that for fraudulent purposes and ultimately gain from an attacker perspective. Components of that include phishing, which is the practice of sending emails appearing to be from a reputable source and just really, as the icon there represents, kind of setting a hook, trying to bait you to get you to provide some of that personal information so they can leverage it for their own gain. And then the next, being very similar, is impersonation. So impersonation is really just acting as if you're someone else with ultimately the goal of gaining access to your systems or some of your data for the company. So when it comes to business email compromise, the first step is to be cautious. Look at email as really just another avenue for accessing your business. So you don't have to be physically there, but it's trying to access your data, and that's one of the communication methods. So you need to be cautious and look for some of these red flag items. The first of those being look for spelling errors. If there's an abundance of spelling errors, certainly kind of proceed with caution from there. And then evaluate the language. And so in that language, if there's things really trying to kind of express urgency and an immediate action, certainly an item to kind of press pause on and make sure you're not reacting without having the right information. The next is verifying links. So verifying the links, so don't just go and simply click on something to check it out. You can do something as basic as hovering on that link to really see if the text that is represented is actually where it is going. And then the next thing is even implementing systems so that those systems will do an inspection of that link and provide a protection prior to relying on the user to determine if it's valid or not. The next one is just check the from address. So as we're looking at our email and we're getting used to just simply looking and trusting the name, we also need to look to the right of that of what actual email is in there. It may say it's from Jake VanDeWater, but the email could be, is not necessarily the valid email of Jake VanDeWater. So we need to confirm that and make sure that it is from whom we expected it to be from. And then going back to the content of the email and just confirming what they're asking for. Are they asking for personal information? Are they asking for logins and passwords? Those should be a great indicator that something is off with this email and it's malicious. So this example here is just a very basic email that shows some of those red flags. And so I'll start with the top here. And it's not a valid email. It's very generic to where typically if there's someone managing your systems, whether that be internal or third party, it's going to be a little more specific as far as after the @ sign for that domain. The next there in that paragraph is really spelling errors. So previous and server, pretty obvious that those are wrong. So starting to kind of draw your attention to perhaps something is wrong with this email and it's not valid. So the next, we start moving into the bulleted items there where they're asking for username and password details. This stuff should never be requested over email. You should never provide it. Certainly flag this as a problem if you get something like this. And then that last sentence there starts talking about the account being suspended, wanting you to act urgently, confirm the information now. And so what they're trying to do here is really cause you a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of concern. The irony is, they want you to do this without having your account disrupted. But if you were to do this, your account would certainly be disrupted. And then the final item is just very generic language. Thank you, IT department. So the more generic, the more broad it gets, the more questionable it should become. So on the business email compromise, I really wanted to show some real examples here of just what we've seen internally. And so this first example is an email that was actually representing themselves as our vice president of marketing. So you'll see his name is Vernon Brown, but the email address is certainly not his email. And so they were requesting vendor payment. Really the next steps of this would be trying to get that set up for some sort of wire transfer and getting that money. The next here representing themselves as our CEO, Mark Shalana. just simply starting to set the stage here of, is this person in the office? You'll see the flag here is that it's an AOL.com email. It's not one of our corporate emails, so certainly being diligent to review that email address and make sure that the name and email are what you expect them to be. The next one representing themselves is our Vice President, Ryan. So this one, once again, the name does not match the email. It's an AOL email, and then it's requesting our accounting to update some payroll information. So trying to get a direct deposit modified to an account of their liking. Fortunately, it was stopped in these instances. And then this one here, just a general email into our marketing group where it offers up a new brochure and tries to get them to click a link. So that link most likely would download a file, and then there would be some additional back-end activity happening with that file to where they would then have access to our systems and really could move on to further steps of causing disruption. This one here is actually an interesting one. It was sent to from our CEO. It was actually a valid email, but it was broad language, and based on education we've done with our employees, this is an example. If it's a simple statement, can you trust the source? And so we have a tool where we're able to actually report emails to our IT group. They'll do research and kind of validate the email within a safe environment and then communicate back to the employees. So this was a good example of one that was a valid email. So it's okay to report those valid emails because with each one that you're reporting, you're certainly educating yourselves and putting the company at less risk by kind of finding those potential threats out there. So when it comes to business email compromise and the defense of it, the first step is really that email address. With those examples, you'll see there were several of them. It was simply the name did not match the email. And so with that, it's a good practice not to overly publish email addresses unnecessarily, whether that be on social media or on the company website. There's certainly going to be needs for those, whether it be your sales staff or certain contact lists for perhaps your accounts payable, but certainly limit the number of those because ultimately, if the attacker doesn't have that email, it limits what they can send to. Maybe there's some internal distribution list that you want to leave them only for internal and not have external emails, and that'll help safeguard. The next one is simply asking the question, were you expecting this email? If it's something odd and you can't trust it, if you know the person, you can certainly put in a call to them to verify the legitimacy of that request. It's certainly a safeguard that you can utilize. And then the next one is evaluating that language. So if it sounds urgent, just call a quick timeout, take a breath, verify, really the validity of the sender as well as the content, and don't be pressured into making that quick, kind of ill-informed decision that could cause greater disruption to you and your business. And then the final one is, question if they're unavailable. If they're asking you to do a number of things, perhaps wire money, send files, provide information, but saying they're not available, maybe don't call them. It's certainly okay to call them to check that further because it's in your best interest and your duty as employee to really protect the company and its information. The next item I wanted to talk about was ransomware. Ransomware is not something new. It's been around for a while, and one of the first instance of ransomware dates back to 1989 and what was referred to as the AIDS Trojan. So ransomware is ultimately just malware. It's malware that gets downloaded, whether that's visiting a website, it's an email, it's a file, and what it does is it encrypts files on your machine or on shared drives connected to your machine. Now, when those files are encrypted without that decryption key, they're rendered useless. So that may be those files can't be used, or it could even go as far as computing systems are rendered useless. So once that happens, typically the user is then presented with a ransom message. This ransom message will provide details of a deadline as well as a payment. And typically that deadline, there'll be language threatening that payment amount will go up or the files will be lost after that date. The payment that those attackers are typically demanding is related to Bitcoin, and that really allows them to kind of remain anonymous through this whole process and kind of get their money and be done. The interesting thing with ransomware is typically it was the fear of ransomware was that you were going to lose those files and lose that information. Now, that's shifted recently to where it's been more so as people are getting good reliable backups that they can just restore those systems, the attackers have shifted their tactics a little bit, and they're actually going to the extent of threatening to release the information online. So if there's information that is perhaps sensitive and you don't want out there in the public, whether that be personal information with human resources files, or maybe some company sensitive data, patents, et cetera, you really have to ask yourself as a business if it's worth paying that ransom or not. Now with these ransoms, not only are they growing, but they're growing significantly. And so we look at this 20 billion projected cost by 2021. Those are not simply just ransom payments. Those are all the other costs associated with getting the business back to normal. That's data loss, that's systems restoration, employee downtime, and just overall impact to the business. So with looking at that number, the FBI will encourage impacted businesses to not pay the ransom. But you'll see here by the stat on your screen that 55% of businesses are actually opting to pay that ransom, simply because maybe they don't have a good backup, or perhaps that information is just too sensitive and they don't want to risk having it released to the public. So when it comes to ransomware defense, the first one is just the email component. So it's very similar to the business email compromise, where the first step is questioning the legitimacy of that email. Don't click on the links, don't download the files if it's not from a trusted source and an email that you expected. The next one is be careful about websites that you visit. A lot of these being ads that could certainly infect you, drive-by downloads, and then by not having a valid website or visiting an infected website, you could get that ransomware file. And then the next being, make sure you're downloading trusted apps. Make sure they're applications that are vetted by your IT department of your company. They're properly licensed. They're not freeware and potential malicious apps. As our keynote mentioned today, 90% of ransomware really started via social media. So it's certainly those ads and that information that they're kind of getting from those individuals to really leverage them for their gain. The next item is those combination of tactics. So these have been, they're not new, but they've really been seen as kind of growing as part of 2020. The first one, we kind of talked a little bit with business email compromise, but it's phishing. And the goal of phishing is really setting the bait, trying to steal customer information. The next one is scraping, specifically with social media, just obtaining that further information and kind of building that online profile. The next one is vishing. This is really scamming people out of money over the phone, kind of a voice phishing, if you will. So when it comes to phishing, it's really the use of that malicious email to gain access to their system, as we talked about with business email compromise. Moving over to scraping. Scraping is really, it was referenced a lot in the keynote this morning of just how much data there is related to us as individuals with our social media activity. So it's going through and taking that content and really building the behavioral context of us as individuals and being able to predict and kind of know some of our personal detail to leverage that against us and access some of the systems that we're involved with. The final one is vishing, and the example I like to give with vishing is just the grandparent gets the phone call, someone is acting as though they're perhaps one of their grandkids, they're in a troubled situation, whether that be hospital, legal trouble, and then they're trying to get them to send money in some fashion. Typical technique is, having that individual go to the store, get some gift cards, and then send the numbers off those gift cards to the, what they believe to be their loved one on the other end of the line, and then they have that money. So beyond that, some of the items I wanted to leave with you today are just some of those basic foundational components that are good items to start with and good items to really review regularly. And the first one is just strong passwords. So we've been talking about this for a while of just using longer passwords, non-standard words, upper and lowercase letters, and then avoiding any sort of common or obvious words. So SDN Communications has performed some work over the last couple of years with the help of Dakota State University, and one of those activities was actually related to evaluating the strength of our passwords. So they have different methods to where it tries to crack the passwords, and one of the methods they use, and it actually identified some of ours, was keywords and numbers. And so a good example is we've just transitioned to fall, and so maybe you're due for a password change, and so what individuals will do is just simply use perhaps the season in combination with the year, so fall 2020. And then as they get into winter, it will be winter 2020. And so as those tools have identified some of those behaviors more and more, that functionality is built in them to test that and quickly identify them. So what guidance we came out of with this exercise is if we start extending the length of our password to 18 or 20 characters, getting to that level of complexity, it actually helps minimize the potential of some of those tools to crack those passwords. So ultimately, it's going to be tough for most users to remember a lot of passwords if they're 18 to 20 characters. So finding a method that works, whether it's components of that help build are built around a specific phrase or song lyric that might help them. But then the next being get to the point where you utilize what's called a password management tool. So the password management tool will allow you to have complex, proper length passwords, unique passwords, and then you can get to the point of really you only have to remember a couple passwords. One to get into your machine, and then one to manage your password management tool. And then the password management tool simplifies the rest of this for you. The next method I want to offer up from a foundational perspective is multi-factor authentication. So first, you use that main username and password to log in and access your systems, but then you have a next level before you're granted full access. That next level could be something as simple as an SMS text verification, and you get a code and have to put in that code, or else it could be a little more sophisticated using tools like Cisco Duo. Cisco Duo is just a mobile application that would be downloaded on a phone, and then after that first authentication method, the user would be presented with a prompt to really allow or deny that access. Now, a great example from SDN is we were performing some of our network assessment with the help of DSU, and through that, they were actually able to crack passwords and started performing some additional attempts at getting deeper into our network. One of our employees had actually just been set up on Cisco Duo, and as part of their access with that, they were continuously getting prompted that someone was trying to log in from an area they weren't familiar with, an IP address that they didn't know. So they were able to deny that, go in and modify their login information, and really prevent any further attempt to access the network. So certainly look at multi-factor authentication as that added layer so that it's not just relied on username and password. The next item we touched on a little bit earlier today, and that was just the virtual private network. So the virtual private network is just, I want you to think of your network with working from home as just, you just extended the reach and the attack surface of your corporate network. So having this VPN really helps first limit the access control back to your corporate area, as well as preventing any data breaches by having that encryption functionality through that tunnel. And then ultimately, you're moving that point of properly protecting your corporate assets. The final item I wanted to leave you with today is really securing Wi-Fi. So I talked about this as far as getting set up at home, and along with having that proper encryption for your Wi-Fi and avoiding any sort of public or open Wi-Fi setup, I want to talk about segmentation. So when it comes to having guests at your home versus having your own home network with what you're doing with your work activity, certainly setting it up so that when users come over, they can log in with a proper password to the guest, but their computers and their devices do not have the ability to communicate directly with your devices. So in the event one of those machines were compromised or that access information got out, it would be segmented from your own individual